So, welcome everybody.
Thanks for joining us. This is the second Quarkus talk of the day, and it's actually a hands-on workshop, which means that while in the first presentation of the day, Giorgos was doing some live coding, now we're going to switch places, and you are going to do the coding without guidance. So what we are going to do is we are going to run through the Quarkus Superheroes workshop, which is available on the URL. Hopefully it's visible in the back. It's quarkus.io/Quarkus workshops superheroes.
Well, I'm sure if you search on Google Quarkus Superheroes,
Yeah, Quarkus Superheroes will definitely do the trick. So
I think we should probably just say that it's completely optional to follow along, right? Ioannis will do some coding as well, so you don't have to...
I'll also participate, like being one of you, so in case you don't have your laptop or you don't have a working environment, you'll definitely have the opportunity to see me walking through the workshop. So, just to get an idea and get a feel of how many of you are going to do it hands-on, raise your hands.
Please raise your hands. Whoever's planning to write some code.
Okay.
Cool.
Have you already opened the Quarkus Superheroes workshop page? Raise your hands if you have. Did you need some help? No? Okay.
Anyone that needs help, just feel free to raise your hand and ask a question or whatever. Come help.
So in this workshop is available online, so you can come back to it in case you don't manage to finish this today. It's a quite long workshop.
It's impossible to finish today.
It's impossible to finish it today, but we hope that we at least go through the first part, which is the villain service. The workshop itself is about creating 3 microservices. One microservice for villains, one microservice for heroes, and one microservice for the fights between the villains and the heroes. Today we are going to focus on the first part, which is the villain service. So if you scroll down the page and go to creating the villain microservice, you'll go to the first call to action.
Sorry again. I think there's also like an architectural diagram somewhere that like outlines what the whole system looks like, right?
I have this one, which is
this is
the description of the villain. And since today we're going to focus just on the villain service, let's just stick to that.
Okay, yeah. So this is, just keep in mind that this is like a small part of a microservice architecture. This is like one microservice that we'll do. Exposes REST and talks to the database, so nothing really complicated. But the rest of the system, if you work through the workshop, you'll see reactive stuff there. You'll see Kafka, messaging, all that cool stuff. And if you go to all the way to the end, there's also UI where you can see like the whole system play out in action.
So you just need to start by creating a directory in which we are going to create our villain service, and then you can just copy directly from the Quarkus site the commands to get started with. I'll switch to my ID where I keep my personal notes and I will be using to work. And let's go to the part where we create the actual service.
Yeah, so the idea here is we're just bootstrapping the project by invoking a Maven command.
Yes, please.
Zoom in if you can. Make it big, a little bigger.
I think that's impossible to Is it better? Is it visible now? So the command that I used is this one, and I created the first service, which is the VLAN microservice. I can go to the REST VLANs directory and do an MVN Quarkus dev, which is exactly what George did this morning. And now I should be able to jump back to my browser and
Excellent. So yeah, this is just...
we can see here that the API VLAN has been created. And if I click that, I just get a generic message which is hello from REST service. Have you managed to create the service and run it yet?
Who tried it and wasn't able to get it to work?
In theory, we should all be seeing something like this. Raise your hand if you do.
Okay, so for those who have done it and it's not working, just let us know. We'll help out. So maybe we should recap like what we did. We just can you yeah.
Yes, we just use the following command, which actually uses the create goal on the Quarkus Maven plugin along with some parameters in order to create the REST VLAN service. And to that goal, we pass some parameters like we want to enable the REST easy reactive Jackson.
Okay, yeah. So all we're doing here is bootstrapping a project, which we'll use to create our API, right?
The skeleton of the project should be something like this, for the generated project. So you should be you should have a directory structure similar to this. And in that directory structure, you should have the VLAN resource, and all these are generated by the Quarkus extension itself. Now let's go back to the node.
Yeah, so
we went through the directory structure already. We visited the VLAN resource.
So yeah, all this stuff is automatically generated, right?
Yep.
If you open up your POM XML, you should see a bunch of stuff where we've added all the dependencies, configured the Maven plugin, everything like that. So you don't have to do any of this. It's just mentioned here, like so you can be sure. And it's explained here so to understand like what Quarkus is doing.
The parameters that we used to create the project, like the selected extensions and so, are also visible in the POM.xml. And I think that at this point we should move to the second part, which is creating the VLAN. Let me go through the VLAN service and the VLAN entities and those stuff.
Does anybody have any questions so far or problems they want addressed? So all good.
The next part is to create an entity class for a VLAN, and this class is going to be annotated with the JPA entity annotation, and also we are going to extend the PANAS entity, and we are going to throw in some properties like the name of the VLAN, on top of which we add some annotations for validation. So for example, we say that we want to have a minimum size of 3, a maximum size of 50.
Is everybody familiar with these annotations that they see here? Like, if anybody is not, let us know. We can explain further.
By the way,
It seems this group is very, very experienced, so we're all good.
let me go through the actual class here. So if you scroll down to the villain entity section on the Voxxed doc, you will find the code, so you will be able to copy and paste it inside your project.
Yeah, we don't expect anybody to write import statements, right?
Yeah, so
That's pretty crazy. So yeah, now we're going to like enhance the
yep.
entity.
Before we do that, I think that we also need to add some extra extensions for the JPA stuff. So, for example, we need to add hydrator JDBC driver for Postgres, because we are going to use Postgres. And to use that, we need to run this command nvn Quarkus extension. The command should be available in
It should be farther along.
yeah.
Everything we're doing here is already like meticulously explained
Yeah.
here.
It's in just above the villain entity section, and you can just copy it. Did you manage to follow along so far? How has okay. I will run the command myself, and let me verify that everything is as expected. So I'll go to open the pam.xml file on the REST villain service, and I should be able to see things like hibernate.
Maybe you didn't run it?
Yeah, maybe not. Let me go back to
I have a question. Who here is a command line hero like Ioannis? Yeah, he's pretty unique.
okay, so we go to pam.xml. Yeah, and now we can see that we've added hibernate or NAS, and also the JDBC drivers for Postgres and whatnot.
Okay, so what's the next step?
So, assuming that we've all added the entity to our project, we can now proceed and enhance the entity by, let me show it on the doc first, by adding some methods for finding villains, and more specifically we are going to add a method for finding a random villain. This method, which is going to be added to the villain entity. Again, we can copy from the website and paste it to our code.
So again, we're not using a repository or anything. We're just like copying static methods into the villain. If you actually looked at the implementation of the find random method, what it did basically was call find all and then like filter out. I just get like one a random villain from, but with using paging, right?
So by adding the find random methods to the villain entity, things should look like that. Once you've reached this point, you should be able to go to the next step, and configure Hibernate. In order to configure Hibernate, we are going to add some properties in our application.properties, which lies under SRC main resources application.properties. Initially, by adding extensions like the Hibernate ORM, we automatically get inside that property file a property like this one, which just tells Hibernate that we want each time we run the application to draw and recreate the schema based on the entities that we have in our project.
Obviously, don't do this in production.
And in this particular case, to recreate the villain table. Do you have any questions so far?
Questions? No questions.
No questions.
It's simple so far. Oh, sorry, yeah, question right here.
What are the extensions that are using right now? For example, when you're using the demo, what are the extensions that are by default?
Did you hear the question? Because
Yeah, what's the minimum set of extensions that we use, and when using the dev mode, what are by default?
okay, the extensions that we used was the Hibernate ORM panel success.
I think the question goes a little to the beginning, like what is enabled out of the box if we don't like add anything, right?
If we don't add anything, I think that we'll get an empty project that it has just REST easy, if I'm not mistaken.
Actually, just CDI.
Just CDI, just Quarkus app. Okay.
So Quarkus Dev will work, but since you don't have any web layer, it won't really refresh anything. So what will happen is that once you add something else to the POM XML, then it'll restart again, right? But there isn't a whole lot of actually no, sorry, you're right that there. If you write command line applications, then you don't need anything other than the CDI module. So you can write a command line application that will restart when you change code on your own. But here, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So here we just started. We bootstrapped the project using the REST user application, and then in a follow-up step, we just added an extension for Hibernate and panels, JDBC Postgres, and I think this is it.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I'd like to hear a bit more about, if it's possible, the actor model, at least how it is implemented with Panas.
You mean for this application, right? Yeah. Yeah, so let's switch to that and see it a little better.
You want to switch to the
whatever, either the code or the website, whatever, just to, let's see the model, like what does the code look like, and why did we add what we added?
What's that? Oh, you want to go to the actual code after
The code, yeah. Let's see the model a little better. What we're doing, right? So initially, like we're extending Panache entity, and Panache entity, as we explained in the previous talk, basically gives you access to a bunch of CRUD methods for the underlying database, right? So in this case, it'll use JPA to access the database. So like things like find, delete.
Yeah, my question is, what's the difference between this and repository?
Ah, okay. So the question is, what's the difference between using this method and using like the traditional what Spring Data JPA does with the repository, right?
Yeah, well, it's a different programming style. This is more influenced by Active Record. You could say it's an Active Record style one, yeah, which is popular in Rails world.
I will say that like it's easier to start out with this, right? Because you can just like you don't have to write any extra classes or anything else. But at the end of the day, when the application like grows, it probably makes more sense to move it out to a repository because it makes things more clear when you're reading the code. It also makes things more testable if you want to do a lot of mocking the database layer, things like that. Although I will say that we do have a mocking layer for Active Record as well. It's just that it uses some other APIs that you might not be familiar with, and it's probably easier for you if you're already like really into the Spring Boot world where everything's a repository. Then you would probably just go down to the repository. Any more questions? Oh, right here.
This entity is annotated like any other entity like Spring Boot. But in this case, in Spring Boot, we have an exception here that we haven't defined the ID, the primary key of the table. Is it going to work here?
Yeah, it is.
Yes, it will, because if you open up the code of Panache entity,
Let's hope that LSP is going to work here.
yeah, see, it's defined there in the superclass. But obviously, you don't have to use Panache when you're using Quarkus and Hibernate ORM, right? You could just not use Panache at all and use whatever abstraction on top you want to. So, like, for example, we have a Spring Data JPA layer, which doesn't force you to extend this
Okay,
Panache.
is it something that you want to find it in, you want to see, show these
You already
Panache
showed-
entity class?
Excuse me?
I'm just asking if there's anything you want to show in the Panache entity class.
You could just show the names of a few names of the methods.
Yeah,
we have.
it gives methods to the entity like persistent class.
I will say, don't look at the implementation of the methods because that's not what exists at runtime. This is the implementation here is basically just to make the compiler happy. This is not what is done at runtime.
And more, okay. Let's close the
Yeah, so let's go back to the villain.
to the villain. And now we can go and create a service that will make use of the entity we created and call all those persistent find and find random methods we created. And we are going to use that service in order to while the entity with the REST endpoint that has been created when we added the REST easy injection to our project. In the workshop, you should be able to find a section which is named after a villain service. And just copy the code from here. And in my case, the service should look something like this.
Yeah, so let's take a look at what this does, right?
So, first thing, it's annotated with the application scope annotation, so that makes the villain service an application scope being. What it means is that it's going to be managed by Quarkus itself, by the Quarkus CDI container it's found in Quarkus. And the service is also marked as transactional. Do you want to say a few things on why we have the transactional on those on the class and on those methods?
Yeah, so basically, like although reading from the database doesn't strictly require a transaction, the Hibernate team at Red Hat seriously suggests you always use transactions even when you're reading. So in this case, what we've done is that we've annotated the class as transactional required, which means that if a transaction already exists with any of these methods are called, it will be used, or otherwise, a new transaction will be created, right? All these methods basically delegate to the entity, and they force, let's say, the creation of a transaction while using it. So there's not much logic, let's say, going on here. Basically, just making sure there's a transaction and calling the CRUD methods on the entity itself.
Yeah, in other words, for example, the find villain by ID method just delegates to the entity itself and calls the PANAS provided method find by ID. And in theory, we should be able to directly use that method in order to perform the find by ID. But here we are following the suggestion from the Hibernate team, and we wrap things up in a transactional method. And this is how we are going to do that.
Yeah, so basically this is just a wrapper, right? But if we did have any like custom business logic, this would be the layer where we would actually put things. Any questions? Go here and then we'll come back.
Yes, initially we saw that first this thing sounds like okay, you consume it as you go. Okay, initially you install based on the micro file, I assume actually, the JSON thing and the rest API to start describing your application. Okay, after that point, you also introduce something for the Postgres, the JDBC driver.
Exactly.
And one validation actually for the Hibernate. Correct, but then you annotated actually the shares like the application scope and you refer to CDI.
Yeah.
Which sort of capabilities we can safely assume that this is offered actually from the platform itself, like the CDI ones that you were mentioning?
I'm not sure if
But you haven't seen any dependency about CDI capabilities?
as George mentioned initially, when we first created the Quarkus application, the CDI, which is the container Arc extension, is already added.
How about you just show it? It's not obvious.
For me it wasn't.
I agree.
You're looking for the rest.
No, it's not obvious.
ARC is our, I've signed away from the ARC is our custom implementation of CDI to work with our build time principles of Quarkus, right? So if you're a normal user of CDI, like in JBoss or Thorntail before Quarkus, then you would probably be using Weld as your CDI container. But in Quarkus, we have our own implementation because we do a whole lot of stuff in build time. But you can safely assume that any way you generate a Quarkus project, Quarkus Arc will always be there, right? You can remove it, but nothing's going to work.
I think that one of the questions we received earlier was what happens if you don't specify any extension at all.
Yeah.
And the response was that the project will be generated and the only extension that will be present in the project is Quarkus Arc.
Right, so for historical reasons, Arc was not part of like the Quarkus core, but for all intents and purposes, you need to add it to like every project. But that's already automatically done by the tooling, right? You don't need to care about that. We had another question.
So I have a question about the transactional, the annotation about transactional. I've used Quarkus. I've been using Quarkus for quite some time now, for about 3 years, and I've seen it in production as well. So I've used it with MongoDB mostly, and in some cases we made a lot of finds, a lot of persistent stuff. So I've seen that even if you don't put add transactional, it does work. And one time that I actually used it in production, it caused some serious problems, which were really, really not understandable, to be honest. So, what is the best practice here?
I assuming that the problems you're referring to were with Mongo or with relational database? Mongo, okay. So up until recently, we did not have transactional support in Mongo for Quarkus, right? So up until very, very recently, that should not have done anything. Like adding transactional should not have done anything. You should have like tried to start a transaction but not do anything. In the case of MongoDB, right? I think like Mongo added transactions version 4 or something like that. We just started supporting it maybe a version or 2 ago. So I don't know exactly what the problem is. Like I'd love to discuss this with you later. But the idea is that we, with transactional initially was coupled to relational databases, right? That's slowly changing, but we'll have to discuss it further. I think there was someone here as well.
How would you inject dependencies in tests?
A little bit louder, please, because
How would you inject dependencies in your tests?
I would use the traditional inject annotation in order to add dependencies to my
We'll
service.
see that in the resource, right? Where when we expose the
Yeah,
REST API.
later on we will take the villain service and inject that to the REST endpoint, which will give you an idea of how it works.
Excellent.
But I think that it's safe to assume that common CDIB
Yeah.
practices and techniques are expected to work fine with Quarkus R.
Yes, that's correct.
Now the next step is, I think, to start the database and the application and see our application connecting to the database. And in theory, by running the Quarkus dev command, we start the Quarkus dev mode. And if you scroll a little bit higher, you will see, let me find it, some log entries, like this one, which doesn't fit exactly in the screen, and this is an indication that a developer service for Postgres has been created. What this means is that when we start the developer mode checks the extensions that we are using. It finds out that we are using JDBC Postgres, and it knows that these extensions provide a developer service. The developer service in question is responsible for providing our application a container that has a Postgres DB running so that we can use it in dev mode. In other words, you don't need to start a Postgres on your own for your application to connect to. The extension itself is smart enough to start the container that runs Postgres and then go back to the app and say, hey, here's the URL that you need to connect to, here's the password, here's all the parameters.
We should just say that this requires you having Docker on your system, right?
Yeah, well, I assume that since it's a requirement in order to run this this workshop. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have a question.
Sorry. You said that during the dev mode, Quarkus creates a Docker for Postgres, for example, for you to use and not care about. We also saw that when you run tests while in dev mode, it uses that exact Docker. What about if you run the tests without the dev mode? Do you still have the Docker, or you have to actually make the configuration to run the tests?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it actually reminds me that I did not mention earlier, in the earlier talk, that the two Docker containers, the one for dev mode and one for testing, are not the same. Right? It's two different containers. So if you're running dev mode and you're running test at the same time, the data you are changing in the test is not reflected in the dev mode, right? So it's two isolated things. Now, if you're not running dev mode, and you're just like doing ambient test or running the test from IntelliJ, whatever you're using, then again, we call it dev services, but it also applies to tests, right? Even if you're not running dev mode. So again, Docker is started before the Quarkus application, and Hibernate will like create the schema for you, insert whatever data you want, and then your application will just exercise.
Yeah, since we are talking about the dev mode thing, it's worth mentioning that in the Quarkus deep dive that we are going to do later today, we are going to show you exactly how you can implement your own dev service for your custom extension, which is really powerful and really interesting, so you should attend that session too. And before we see the dev mode in action, why don't we create and we wire the VLAN service with the VLAN REST endpoint?
Excellent. So again, the instructions here are super detailed, right? You'll see everything from what you're supposed to execute, why you're supposed to execute it, like what the output is. This is super detailed, but for folks that are like more experienced as this group, I'm sure you like. There's a lot of stuff you can like skip through and just go to like call to action to see like what you're supposed to do. Right?
So in theory, you should just go to the VLAN resource endpoint section and just grab the code from there. And let's see a few things about what we have here. So initially, the VLAN resource is generated by us through the addition of the Quarkus REST-easy injection extension. And we've passed to the create command, or when we first create the project, I think that the path that we see here. But the method just the resource just contained a single method which just displayed something like hello from REST-easy reactive. Now in this section, what we are doing is that for starters, we are injecting to the VLAN resource the VLAN service of the VLAN instance.
So this answers the question we had earlier, how injection. So we support both field injection, and in this case we're doing constructor injection, right? So there's a single constructor where the parameters are all beans, so Quarkus knows how to set this up.
Yeah, but we could have, for example, add inject, VLAN service, and everything would be fine. Along with the VLAN service, we also inject a logger that we are going to use later on. And let's stick to a get method that we add here, which is for /random, and just gets a random VLAN by calling the find random VLAN method in the VLAN service, and also logs a method. In my project, the VLAN service, the VLAN resource should look like this. Yep. And if I jump back to my cell and restart the dev mode, I'm seeing all the VLANs, and let's get a random VLAN back.
Very nice.
Did you know Callisto?
Not me, no.
No, me neither.
See, there's superherodb.com. Oh, that's interesting.
Anyway, when I was running that on at home yesterday, it was Darth Vader, Darth Vader, Darth Vader.
So maybe you should also show like where this data is coming from, right? How was this inserted into the database initially?
I think that I skipped this part, didn't I?
There we go.
Yeah, I skipped a step, which is grabbing the import data SQL from the workshop, which contains all the variants, and adding that to
So basically, yeah, we just want to see like what import SQL looks like. Right? There we go. So yeah, if you're wondering like why we saw so many villains, this is the reason. Quarkus will execute this import SQL file when you start the dev mode or when tests are run. There is a way to do this for production, but you almost certainly don't want to do that. That's why it's not enabled ready. So, is there anything else? Okay, so a bunch of tests to add, right?
yeah, I think that the next logical step is to go back and create a test. But before that, you mentioned you don't wanna do that in production.
Right.
So before we do the testing, why don't we see how we do things in production and how we separate configuration between dev mode and production.
Yeah, very good point.
By adding properties and prefixing them with the percentage symbol and the name of the profile, we pretty much have a profile-specific configuration. Prod is the profile that will run by default when we run our application, not in dev mode. So in dev mode, in other words, in dev mode, these configurations are ignored, but when we run our application in prod mode, doing things like Java, -jar, and the name of the Quarkus subjar, this will be enabled.
Yeah, so that's one way to do it, and that's how it's shown in the workshop. The other way to do it is like, there's also the Spring Boot way where you separate the files, like application -dev properties or application -prod properties, so that also works. But here for simplicity, we'll just show the one file, application properties, and you throw specific profile properties in there. Do we have that here?
Give me a second, please.
Sure. Yeah, we're skipping the test for now.
We'll get back to the test shortly. For now, I'll just add those properties to my application with properties.
Okay, so yeah, before adding that, what we want to do is we want to show you that, okay, you have your code now, and how does it look like to run the application if you're not running with Quarkus Dev, right? What does it look like to run like a production application? So first of all, we need to package the application. Right? We need to create a runnable jar.
Yeah, but we need to do that from within the application directly.
Yeah, that will help. We have tests. See, so here we're just running tests and dev services is coming up. We didn't want it in this case because our test doesn't pass, but we'll just skip them. Okay, so.
And to run the application directly in prod mode, all we need to do is call the Java -jar and pass as an argument the Quarkus run jar, which is under target Quarkus app.
Do you think this will work? I don't.
Why would it work?
Where's the database?
The main reason is that we are spoiled from Quarkus dev mode, and we are used to expect that the database will be there. But in prod mode, someone has to go out and set up a database for us. Now, for the needs of this workshop, the role of the, let's say, production database, we are going to use, let me find that. We are going to use Docker Compose, and we are going to use the Docker Compose link handle app in order to bring all the services.
Yeah, so as we said earlier, this workshop is very, very large, so parts of it are in Kafka, parts of it are using this Postgres. What this Docker Compose has everything, right? So this is launching Kafka, it's launching Postgres as well. But we only care about Postgres, but we'll go ahead and use that. And also, if you saw earlier the properties that we configured, we configured a specific username and password, which are pre-baked into this Docker Compose file.
So we use Docker Compose, and we now have a container running Postgres, and we know that this is accessible through localhost 543.
19 hours ago, what, were you practicing 19 hours ago?
No.
It's the first time?
Yeah. Well, actually, I went through the workshop in order to get a feel of how long how far we can go in 1 hour and 10 minutes.
And did you get to the end?
I barely managed to get to the end of the VLAN service. We saw that we bound to localhost 5432, which is exactly the property that we are passing through the prod profile to our application. And now I expect that by running a Java manager from the REST VLANs directory in, sorry about the butterfingers, but I'm using a cast.
Yeah, we're lucky you can type it all. Excellent.
Yeah, and everything is fine. And now we should be able to go back to our app, hoping that we get a more decent VLAN. Prometheus. Yeah. Yeah, Superman.
Injustice, okay. Or some weird comic.
Yeah. I can live with Superman.
So, at this point where we have like our production-like application running, so if someone were to provision us like a real database and we could configure things, obviously we wouldn't want to put real configuration in application properties. We would either use environment variables or Java system properties. Like our Kubernetes support has support for config maps, secrets, service binding.
Yeah.
What else? We have Vault, Console, Spring, where's that thing? Spring config server, whatever. So all the good stuff.
Okay, I think that we have around 15 minutes left, so I'm wondering if we should go back and add the missing test.
Yeah. That's
yeah.
a good idea. Yeah, it's hard to ship anything to production without tests, right? Maybe it was easy in the good old days.
Really? I mean, really?
So, as for those of you who are in the talk before, the Quarkus talk, we heavily lean on rest assured for these tests. We find that like the API is a pretty good fit for testing REST APIs, and that's what we're going to do here. Right? So there's a bunch of ways to test like this application, you might want to test the database layer on its own, or the service layer, like logging, things like that. Here, we're only showing testing like a functional test, right? So end-to-end for the application itself, functional test that treats the application basically as a black box, so it only hits the REST API and gets data back and asserts things based on the API itself, and it doesn't look at the database or anything like that to see. But obviously, you might feel differently about how to test applications like this. So these test classes, you can inject any CDI bean in here you want, if you so you can manually check the database here or do anything you like.
Okay, let's pick a random method and just walk through that in order to get a feel of how it works. So here we just create a random ID and we just try to grab from the REST API a non-existent VLAN, and we accept get as a status code that we have no content for the specified art. Let me get that too. Yeah, we have it here, and let's try to run the tests. Would you run them directly, or would you prefer the dev mode?
Let's do dev mode. Everyone knows how to invoke ambient test. Although I'm sure that some folks would like to see how you would run a specific test for a specific class from Maven.
And how is that villain resource?
Villain resource test.
Das.
Yeah, hash.
Has.
Yeah, so this will just, no dev mode, just run one test, let's see how it goes. So again, test container starting up, using Postgres 14, save the application.
Even though we don't run the test in the dev mode, we still have the dev service support.
Yes, which is, yeah, it's very, very important. So when we say things like dev mode, anything dev related that isn't usually specific to dev mode, it's when you're in the development, your development cycle, right? So development cycle obviously means I either write application code or I write test code, right? So most things that apply to application code usually apply to test code as well.
So now that we managed to go through the test, and we've already built the production packets, why don't we go to the next step, which is about configuring logging. And here we are just going to copy those properties, which just enable console logging and specify things like the format, the level threshold, and things like that.
Yeah, so all the logging configuration in Quarkus is done via application properties, or like system properties, or environment variables when you want to override things in production, right? So there's no like XML, like you have to log back, things like that. And you see here that we don't have the like percentage prod, which means that it applies to all modes, right?
Both dev mode and production or whatever.
Oh, Emacs, huh? So I actually know what you're using now.
So let me read back at the application of and let's restart the app in the broad mode. And we see that now the log is a little bit darkened because we did that, and that changes in the threshold and the log format.
So yeah, there's a bunch of properties. Maybe you should like show where folks can find all the configuration properties for Quarkus. I mean, because that's a question we get a lot. So people often like get a feeling that there's probably this configuration property that Quarkus has to do something, but they don't know where to find it. And sometimes the IDE doesn't autocomplete wonderfully, although it usually does, but not always. So if you go to actually all guides, and there's all config. If you change the URL here,
Yeah, it's all config.
yeah, or I think it.
Yeah,
I think that's it. But if it's not, we'll just search Google and Google Forms. Yeah, so all configuration options. So here you have like per extension, all configuration options that you can use, right? And there's also a very important part. You want to explain like what the little lock thing is in front of properties.
Sorry, I was
The lock, the little lock that's in front of the property name. It says fixed at build. So this is a very important distinction that Quarkus makes, and as far as we know, no other framework does. There are properties in Quarkus that you can only set when you're building the application, and you can't change them in production, right? So you can't change them at runtime. The idea here being is that when properties are fixed like this, it's a lot easier for Quarkus to optimize code and make things a lot faster and a lot more secure at production, right? So any property you see here that has a lock in front of it means that you can only set it when you're doing an NPM package, and you can't change it when you're running the application. If you do change it, Quarkus will give you a very, very informative message that you're trying to change a property that will not have effect. So yeah, for example, our logging properties. If you want to search all our logging properties, there's actually a search on,
Yeah, for example, the darken property that we specified at the end of our application properties, specified how much colors should be darkened. As you can see here, compared to the initial console log, it's slightly darker.
Okay, let's see, we're at 3:30, and there was a weird thing with the schedule that I was looking at earlier. So the schedule says the next session starts in 5 minutes, but this one ends at 10. So I think that we'll probably just call it for this session, take like a 5-10 minute break, and then we'll return.
We can continue with the BOF session.
Yeah, with the BOF, which is any of you that are interested in Quarkus can ask us anything you like. Holly, Dimitris, which I think he's out there somewhere, and the two of us will be here. We'll try to answer any question you have. So do think of anything Quarkus related, and we'll be back in like 5-10 minutes with those questions. And then save some energy for the final session, which is a deep dive. So thank you very much.